All right, let's jump right into this explainer and look at how two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, managed to solve a massive engineering puzzle. A puzzle that had, frankly, completely baffled the world's most credentialed experts. We're talking about the Wright Brothers, Wilbur and Orville, but we're not just going to look at them as dusty historical figures. We really want to dig into their incredibly brilliant, methodical problem-solving process. How exactly did two guys without university degrees manage to conquer the sky?
Well, to truly grasp the sheer magnitude of what they pulled off, we have to understand the intense skepticism they were up against. It's actually captured perfectly, and maybe a little tragically, by the scientific consensus of the late 19th century. Take Lord Kelvin. He was literally one of the most brilliant and respected physicists alive, and in 1895, he flat out declared that heavier-than-air flying machines were impossible, period. So when Wilbur and Orville started their work, they weren't just fighting gravity, right? They were fighting the established scientific dogma of the entire Western world. But for the Wrights, that impossible dream actually started way earlier, long before they even cared about what the scientific consensus was. Back in 1878, their father, who was a bishop, brought home a little toy helicopter. It was just a simple rubber band-powered thing, based on a design by a French aeronautical pioneer named Alphonse Pinot. And that tiny little toy just planted a seed of curiosity in the boys. A seed that would sit there in their minds just kind of germinating for 2 whole decades before it finally began to bloom into reality.
Now, what's really fascinating here is their incredibly unique mechanical intuition. At the time, you had these incredibly well-funded pioneers like Samuel Langley, who was the secretary of the Smithsonian, and they were pouring all their resources into massive engine power and raw wing lift. They basically just wanted to force a machine into the sky. But the Wrights? They drew on their day jobs, they built and balanced bicycles, and they realized everyone else was entirely missing the true problem. Getting into the air wasn't the real challenge. The real challenge was, how do you actually achieve balance and steer the thing once you're up there? And it's that intense focus on control that led to a literal spark of genius in 1899. Wilbur was working in their bicycle shop, the Wright Cycle Company, which, had already been giving them all this vital hands-on experience with lightweight structures. And while he was just idly twisting an empty bicycle inner tube box in his hands, Wilbur noticed something huge. Twisting opposite corners changed the angle of the box's surfaces. He immediately realized this exact same principle could be applied to airplane wings to make them bank left or right. They called this concept wing warping.
So that single breakthrough laid the groundwork for their most brilliant innovation, which is 3-axis control. And by the way, this is still the foundation of all aviation today. They realized a pilot needed to master 3 distinct movements. First is pitch, moving the nose up or down, controlled by a forward elevator. Second is roll, banking left or right, achieved through that wing warping technique Wilbur figured out with the box. And finally, yaw, rotating the nose left or right, which they managed with a rear rudder. This 3-axis system, it was the absolute master key to flight.
Of course, knowing the theory and making it work in reality are 2 totally different things. And looking at their journey through the early 1900s, it is clear they were just relentlessly methodical. Based on U.S. Weather Bureau recommendations, they packed up and headed to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, mostly for its consistent winds and soft sand for crashing. Now, 1900 and 1901 brought some pretty disappointing glider tests. Actually, Wilbur was so discouraged at one point, he supposedly said it would be 50 years before men flew. But they didn't quit. Instead, they went back to Dayton, built their own custom wind tunnel, tested over 200 wing shapes to generate their own data, and by 1902, with a refined glider, they had totally mastered aerodynamic control. Okay, so with control mastered, they finally needed power. But when they looked at the available market, literally no existing engine was both light enough and powerful enough to put in an airplane. So what did they do? They built it themselves. They handed an almost impossible challenge to their shop mechanic, Charlie Taylor. In just 6 weeks, Taylor built a custom 4-cylinder gasoline engine completely from scratch. It pumped out 12 horsepower and weighed a mere 180 pounds. For the era, that was an absolute marvel of lightweight engineering. But obviously, an engine needs propellers, and here comes another stroke of pure genius. By using all that incredible data from their wind tunnel, they realized our propellers shouldn't act like a ship's screw pushing through water. No, a propeller is really just a rotating wing, generating thrust the exact same way a wing generates lift. They designed twin counter-rotating propellers to cancel out the gyroscopic torque, and they achieved a staggering 66% efficiency. To put that into perspective, hitting 66% is considered phenomenal, even by modern aerodynamic standards. So the machine was finally ready. They built the Flyer, a 605-pound biplane with a 40-foot wingspan, all made of spruce wood and muslin fabric. On December 14, 1903, Wilbur won a simple coin toss to be the first pilot. But as he tried to take off, he overcorrected the pitch, the aircraft stalled out, and the Flyer actually suffered some minor damage. It was a pretty heartbreaking false start, but they dusted themselves off and immediately set to work on repairs. 3 days later, on December 17th, it was Orville's turn. And the conditions at Kill Devil Hills that morning were absolutely brutal. We are talking freezing temperatures and punishing winds gusting up to 27 miles per hour. In fact, the wind was so strong, they didn't even need to launch from a hill like they did with the gliders. They just set up a 60-foot launching rail right there on the flat ground. The stage was finally set to make history. The progression they made over that single morning is just staggering. At 10:35 a.m., Orville takes off for the iconic first flight, which lasted just 12 seconds and covered 120 feet. By the way, that exact moment was captured in a world-famous photograph by a lifesaver named John T. Daniels. But look at how they progressed in a matter of hours. By the fourth flight of the day, Wilbur was back at the controls, and he flew for a full 59 seconds, covering an incredible 852 feet. They hadn't just gotten off the ground. They had proved the machine was truly controllable and sustainable. You can only imagine how overwhelming the excitement must have been. That evening, Orville rushed to the telegraph office and sent this triumphant message to their father. It read, "Success. 4 flights. Average speed through air 31 miles, longest 57 seconds. Inform press, home Christmas." Now, he actually miscalculated that final flight time slightly in all the excitement. It was 59 seconds, not 57, but the message itself was crystal clear. They had done the impossible. But here's where the story takes a really bizarre turn. You'd think the whole world would stop and celebrate, right? Well, shockingly, despite this monumental, paradigm-shifting achievement, the press largely ignored it. Their own hometown paper, the Dayton Journal, wouldn't even run the story. The Associated Press sent out a completely garbled, inaccurate version of what happened. The greatest minds in the world had declared flight impossible, so the public just flat out refused to believe 2 bicycle mechanics had actually done it. But the brothers, they didn't let the lack of press stop them for a second. They just kept iterating. By 1905, their Flyer 3 could bank, circle, and fly for over 30 minutes at a time. It really wasn't until 1908, when Wilbur gave these breathtaking public demonstrations in France, that European audiences were electrified, and the world finally woke up to practical airplanes. Sadly, though, their later years were incredibly tough. They had to aggressively defend their patents in these exhausting legal wars against competitors. And tragically, Wilbur died of typhoid fever in 1912 at just 45 years old. Orville lived on until 1948, actually living long enough to witness the dawn of the space age. And Orville really had to fight tooth and nail to protect their legacy. For decades, the Smithsonian Institution stubbornly credited their own former secretary, Samuel Langley, and his failed aerodrome as the first aircraft capable of flight. Orville was so insulted by this blatant rewrite of history that he literally boxed up the original 1903 Flyer and loaned it to the Science Museum in London in protest. It took until 1942 for the dispute to be fully resolved, and the Flyer finally took its rightful place in the Smithsonian in 1948. So the crucial takeaway from all of this is the sheer mind-bending speed of the evolution they triggered. Think about this number for a second. 66. Just 66 years separated that freezing 12-second, 120-foot hop on a windy beach from humanity landing a spacecraft on the moon. By solving the fundamental problem of 3-axis control, the Wright brothers essentially compressed what might have been a century of aeronautical development into a single generation. And that brings us to our final thought. The Wright brothers proved that patient, systematic, scientific problem-solving could conquer what the absolute smartest, most credentialed minds of the age had declared entirely impossible. As Orville once asked, if birds can glide for long periods of time, then why can't I? If 2 self-taught mechanics from Ohio could crack the code of the skies by simply reframing the problem around control rather than power, it begs a really fascinating question for all of us. What limits are we accepting as impossible today that simply require a totally new perspective?